Greetings, everyone. You're all welcome to our October meetup. My name is Lyndon Tiffel, and I am the convener for Women in RMEL, which stands for Women in Research, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. And if you're new to this community, we essentially an online community that seeks to accelerate the careers of women in the research, monitoring, evaluation, and learning sector or field. And so you're all welcome. Thank you for making time to be part of our meetup today. So before we dive into the main reason why we're here, I would like to take us through our agenda and then we'll engage in a brief icebreaker before we go into our conversation for today. We have our special guest who I'll introduce to us shortly after our icebreaker. So permit me to share my screen. In the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, what your profession is, and also where you're joining us from. All right, so I'm sharing my screen now. So today we will be engaging our speaker or our guest in the person of Akua Nyame-Mensah, and we'll be engaging in a Q&A on practical strategies for building adaptive leadership skills. So this is our agenda for today. So we'll engage in an icebreaker, as I said, and then I'll introduce Ikea, and then we'll dive into our Q&A, and then we'll have our announcements, and then we'll end our session for today. All right, so for our icebreaker, I'd like us to share what are the character traits you would want to see or you think a leader should have. So please feel free to share in the chat, or if you would like to unmute and share with us, please feel free to do that. So we'll just take a few minutes to ponder over our question. What are the character traits of a leader? Okay, so we have Meryl Lynn. She says a leader should be visionary. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. I agree. And I'm sure most of us agree as well. Any more? Let me see if there are any hands raised. Okay, are there any more submissions, thoughts? I believe some of us on the platform are leaders in our own right, so you can also share what character traits you have that make you a great leader as well. Or at least you've been told you have character traits that you have that others are eagerly looking to have. Let me see the chat. Okay, for the sake of time, we'll continue, but please do well to share. As long as the chat window is available, you can always share your thoughts on what you consider as character traits that a leader should have. All right, so I will stop sharing now, and then I will introduce our special guest, Akua Nyame-Mensah. So before we dive into our conversation, I will share her profile with us. Okay, so Akua Nyame-Mensah is a leadership and culture advisor. She's a certified executive and leadership coach, and she's the host of the Open Door Conversations podcast and People Before Strategy Roundtable. She partners with senior leaders and scaling organizations to strengthen how they lead, manage, and align their people. As a former startup operator, IKEA helped launch and lead platforms that were later acquired, bringing a unique perspective on business building and people performance. IKEA combines business strategy with human-centered coaching to help her clients move from overwhelmed to aligned. Her approach blends evidence-based frameworks with practical tools that support long-term performance and people growth. She has lived, worked in, and consulted across 30 plus countries, delivering immersive leadership experiences in person and virtually. Her client list includes organizations like Google, Unilever, Heineken, Choice Hotels, and high growth startups across the globe. IKEA holds a leadership-focused MBA from the Africa Leadership University School of Business and a BA from Bryn Mawr College. She is a member of Google's Mastery faculty and serves as a mentor and advisor to multiple global accelerators and nonprofits. So, participants, please help me welcome Akua Nyame-Mensah. Akua, you're welcome. We're excited to have you with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Great. All right, so we will dive straight in, and participants, please feel free to also chip in with your questions in the chat window, which I will also do all to engage IKEA on, and hopefully we'll have a very fruitful conversation today. All right, so IKEA, would you like to describe how your leadership journey has been so far?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, I think, to start with. And I think what is really interesting, I would say, about my journey is that it definitely hasn't been a linear one. I think one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn, and as I think about how I support my clients, is really that there's always going to be ups and downs. Your journey is going to look a little, potentially sideways or crooked sometimes, or kind of go back in some people's minds. But I would say that I, you know, if there was, I guess, one word I would use to describe sort of my leadership journey, I would say just curious. I feel like I'm just someone who's always just been really curious and always been really focused on keeping track of how things are doing. And because I've been curious and I've been open to keeping track of how things are going or how things maybe aren't going my way, I've also been willing to shift and try different things and kind of push myself outside my comfort zone a little bit. Let me maybe add, I guess, a little bit more context to it. If I was to think about leadership from the perspective of leading others, which is what most of us typically think of leadership as, right? The opportunity to, hire and fire people, bring people along, tell people what to do. I've been doing that for a really long time. So I've had the opportunity to lead primarily or at first within, I guess you can say, athletic settings. So I've always played sports. I've been an athlete for my entire life. And so I've always had the opportunity for some reason to be a captain or for some reason to lead different teams. And so that's kind of where I would say a lot of my initial leadership thoughts were, I guess you can say, to some extent, cultivated around supporting other people with their stretching to start off with, telling people what to do on the football fields, and then around the track, and then other sports that I've played. So that's initially, I think, where a lot of sort of my leadership qualities were probably initiated, and then that sort of led to leading clubs. I've always had a lot of interest, and so even in school, I was vice president of this thing, president of this thing, leading this particular initiative, wanting this, and because I wanted it, I created it and sort of brought people along with me. And so I think I just always, to some extent, been open to putting myself out there, because I think leadership can be very unforgiving in many ways. And when you take that step to put yourself out there to say, hey, I want to do this, anyone want to support, or hey, like I have an idea of how we can move forward, there's always a likelihood that there's going to be people who don't want to do that, don't want to follow, or people who disagree with you. And so I would say a lot of my early leadership perspectives were kind of shaped in that way at school. And then if we talk about leadership from the perspective of the workplace, my first real job, actually, my first real full-time job, I would say, was actually working for an organization that sort of tasked me with, launching and starting this online platform and figuring out how to find people to help me build it. Prior to that, I was working or in the development sector. It wasn't a real full-time job, like it was like a contract job. I was telling people what to do though, which I think is really interesting. I wasn't directly like responsible for them. I couldn't fire them, but I still was telling them what to do in that way. But in terms of like my first real full-time job, yeah, I was hired to launch and run an online platform and very much had to figure out how to get people to listen to me, how to get people to follow what I was saying and be open to trying things that they had never done and things I had also never done as well, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, I think long story short, my leadership journey has been really windy. It's been really interesting. But I think what is even more interesting is thinking about it from this perspective of self-leadership, which is where I typically start when I'm working with leaders, that it's important to focus first on leading yourself, and that if you're not leading yourself, you can't actually lead others. I mean, you might be kind of doing it, but it's probably not going to be sustainable. You probably have a lot of people maybe talking behind your back. And, it really might be difficult for you to be able to hit, whatever targets or KPIs you've set for yourself. Because one of the things I always talk about when I'm working with my clients is this idea that people are not just listening to what you're saying, they're also watching what you're doing. And so if you're not leading yourself, if you're not being consistent with your messaging in terms of how you're showing up and what you're sharing with other people, once again, it's not going to be sustainable. Or if people are to some extent, in quotes, showing up, they're probably not going to be getting the results that you want or the results that you need in order to truly be successful, right? So there's a lot of what I call sort of disengagement, right? So they're showing up, they're there, they're taking their paycheck, but whether or not their heart is in it, that's not important. But what's important is what you've outlined as the expectations, they might not be meeting those and they might not be willing to exceed them or go above and beyond, which is something a lot of leaders sort of expect people to do. And so I think, in terms of my self-leadership journey, I think that's also something that's been really consistent. I think I'm very values driven, and a lot of the values really start with that curiosity, right? I'm someone who loves a challenge. And so as I look at all the different roles I've taken on in my life, and even to what I do now, working for myself for the last 8 years, I love the challenge. And so there's this element of curiosity, this element of growth, this element of, even if I don't know all the pieces of the puzzle, I'm willing to put my neck out there and at least try and attempt to be intentional. I think that's really helped to drive my journey, or as I like to call it, my odyssey, right? Because there's going to be ups and downs. It's not this linear thing. For the 30 plus years I've been on this planet.
Great. Thank you so much for kicking us off with that powerful response. I personally kind of see some similarities also with taking up leadership roles back in school. Not because I was like very charismatic, like, but more like, yeah, I mean, probably people saw leadership potential in me that I personally didn't see in myself. Like I was someone who always liked to take things seriously and like always wanted things to turn out right. So maybe that's one of the things that people, yeah, like to
Definitely.
see.
Definitely. Can I just butt in really quickly?
Sure.
I think it's really interesting as we think about and reflect on what our leader looks like. And I invite all of you on here, anybody who's listening to the recording, like I say the word leader, I'm curious what comes to mind. What does that image look like? What are the things that come up for you, right, as you think about what a leader is? And I think that a lot of those images are not actually, that's the right way I want to put it, aren't always based on reality, if that makes any sense, right? So a lot of times, and there's some interesting research around this, people say leader, what do they think of? A white man. right? Dress in a suit, right? That's
Yeah.
great. That could be a leader in some instances, but especially in the world that we live in, the part of the world we live in, that's not, the people who are truly driving change or able to create performance. And so, as you mentioned the word charismatic, I also think that that's a very specifically American perspective on what a leader looks like. And I actually don't
Mm,
think that the majority of leaders who are running things, and once again, we define success in different ways, and that's a huge
mm,
piece.
yeah.
I don't think being charismatic is actually that important of a trait.
Mm,
And I think it's unfortunate that we live in a world, and I would say a lot of the work I do, right? I'm really I always try and bring, I guess, a little nuance and a little I maybe not backstory, but like always try and let people wrap up their heads around the fact that a lot of the research that we use and a lot of the information that we share when we're doing work with leadership, organizational development, culture work, unfortunately, a lot of it's driven by what's happening in the US and research that's being conducted in the US. And so I think it's also really important to wrap our heads around the fact that a lot of the models then, right, that we use and a lot of these frameworks and a lot of, once again, pictures and stories we tell ourselves are based on that. And that's not the reality of everybody. That's just the reality of a very small part of the world. So yeah. So anyway, just wanted to
true,
share that. I don't think being charismatic is useful at all.
true.
And I think that sometimes people who are the most charismatic and most outgoing, because to me, when I think of the word charismatic, what comes up is also extroverted. They don't always
Mm,
make the best leaders, right? Because there's
mm,
different elements that you need in
true.
different situations. So someone who's charismatic might be really great in certain roles, but they probably need someone else to balance themselves out in a
Mm,
different way. And that's okay because leaders can't have all the
oh,
skills, right? And that's why you
true.
surround yourself with people to support you on things that you're not as good at or don't have a competitive advantage in,
Mm,
or can't make time for. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. That just comes to mind. Yeah.
true. Great. Okay. So yeah, I think you've kind of hit on what I wanted to ask you about how your key experiences have influenced your leadership journey so far. So I think, yeah, you've given a very great response on that. But can you share how you've approached building diverse teams, considering that like you've worked in so many places or like in different kinds of industries? Yeah, how that has been um yeah, like how you've approached things like in building teams and getting people to work with you as a leader.
Yeah. I mean, I think diversity is really, really an important concept. And I think that sometimes, once again, the word diversity, depending on the part of the world that you're living in, looks different, right? So I live in Accra, Ghana. Most of my work experience has actually been between Ghana and Nigeria. And so I would say diversity for the specific places I sort of had the majority of my structured leadership experience where I had the title, right, where I was doing the work was really around bringing in people who had very different backgrounds to me, spoke very different languages to me, lived very different lives, right? Went to very different schools than I did, right? And I think that level of diversity is also really important in parts of the world where maybe we look a little bit more like each other, right? We all look the same for the most part. We have similar names to some extent, right? I have the perfect name for this part of the world. And then I show up and I sound like this. And people are like, what is happening? Right? And so, when I think about the initial teams that I built when I was living here, and then when I moved to Nigeria, I actually inherited a team. So I didn't do much hiring, and well, I did a lot of firing in Nigeria, not a lot of hiring in Nigeria. That's how I put it. But here I would say I really just tried to focus on the gaps that I knew I had. And
Mm,
then really just tried to focus on people who I thought were willing to give me their perspective. I think that, any of you on here that spent any time working in Ghana, one of the things that you'll probably see is that there's a very specific type of work culture that's very hierarchical. People do not ask questions. People do not voice dissent, even if it's done politely. And people kind of just fall in line, right? I think that's, fortunately, unfortunately, right? I think it can be good in some ways, but I definitely think there's some cons, especially if you're working in the startup space, and that was the space I was working in.
mm,
And so knowing this, I, wanted to make sure that I was bringing people in that were willing and open to be curious, right? So maybe
Mm,
it's once again just looking for something that I felt I had and trying to see that in other people in a way. And then once again, also making sure I was hiring for the gaps I knew that I had. So I don't speak a Ghanaian language, so I wanted to make sure I brought people on who are comfortable having, sales conversations and languages I'm not fluent in. So bringing in people who, were willing to speak, tree, ga, pidgin, things I can't do,
mhm,
and things I'm not willing to pretend I can do. I think that that's another piece as well, sort of knowing yourself, knowing your values, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses. I call that cultivating your self-awareness. That's a huge piece. And I
yeah.
think that if you want to be someone that's able to bring together a group of people that have a diversity of thought, a diversity of, if we want to talk about the superficial appearance, the diversity of these pieces, I think that you have to be a very self-aware leader and a leader who's willing to learn things about themselves. So that's the first piece. I think the second piece is a willingness to engage and a willingness to be a little bit innovative, I guess, in how you're
Mm,
trying to, flesh these pieces out. And also sort of this willingness to engage with trying to come up with a way to overcome some of your blind spots. Everybody has blind spots. Everybody has bias. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, where you grew up. There are assumptions and stories you tell yourself. Those are biases. And so thinking about ways to overcome that. And for me, one of the ways that I attempted to overcome that was by also leveraging my existing team. So as I hired, I'd also would leverage sort of the collective knowledge of my team to help support with, finding other people and bringing other people on as well. Because they could see things I couldn't, they would see things from a different perspective, and I trusted them in a in a way because we had worked together. I think another piece around being able to build, teams of people who maybe don't think exactly like you is, being open to some extent to some level of dissent and not constantly having your ego bruised or like feeling like I have to be right. They have to listen to me. They have to do it my way. And I think once again, just very organically, naturally, I went through those cycles where I was just like, why can't they do it my way? And then I got to this point where I was like, wait a second, they're not me. They didn't have similar background to me. And so if they're getting to the same result, why should I, be so
mm,
particular about what it should look like, right? I just set the expectation that we're trying to get to point B. And if how they get to point B looks different from me, as long as it's not illegal, right? So the type of work I do, right? It doesn't work. It's not like, working at an airport or, working for an airlines where you have like a checklist of things you have to go through in order to make sure the plane can get in the sky, right? So I don't work in a space that requires that, right? If I
yeah.
did, or if there was a specific task that requires a little bit more of that, you have to do these things specifically, that's a different point.
Mm,
But in the area, that I've chosen to work in, that's not necessarily the case. So also just being open to allowing people to have a different approach to get things done.
mm,
And so once again, like I said, you could be working with people who look like you, who sound like you, maybe have a very similar background, but they're not going to do things the same way you do.
yeah.
And that's a diversity of thought as well. And so that's, I think, also an important thing to consider. And I think to be
Mm,
able to do that, you just have to be willing to be self-aware, to check yourself, and to sometimes be humble and sit down.
true. Great nuggets. So following up on what you said, would you say that some individuals find leadership easier to practice? And also, in the context of leadership, can you also define what adaptive leadership is? If yes, if there are some participants here who might be new to what adaptive leadership is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that everyone can define leadership, it's like you can define leadership honestly in so many different ways. And so I would say it's really a very company specific and then sometimes can be an individual leader specific um evaluation at the end of the day, right? So and this is something I think that's really important. And one of the reasons why whenever I'm having a conversation about leadership, like I'm not telling people there's one right way to lead, right? There's
Mhm.
one right like leadership approach, and there isn't, because every single context is different, every single organization has different values, a different mission, a different way in which they do things. And so the way you show up as a leader within one context might be considered wrong in quotes in another context, simply because of how that company has defined the ways of working, right?
Yeah.
Defined and redefined. Another key piece is also keeping in mind that within organizations, as you're thinking about culture, as you're thinking about how people show up, there's a lot of implicit and explicit expectations.
Mm.
And I think, unfortunately, leadership many times has these implicit expectations. Oh, I thought you would do this. Like, you should
Mm.
know this. You're this, right?
Yeah.
And that's not really helpful, especially for a newer leader. And that's why it's so very important for organizations to get really clear on helping, potential leaders, existing leaders understand how they want them to show up to some extent. I think we're really good at talking about what we don't want. I think what's a lot
Mm.
harder a lot of times within organizations about what we do want to see. And I
Yeah.
think that can be incredibly helpful and show leaders how they can show up. Once again, no two leaders within an organization are going to show up the same way, but at
Mm.
least having some of those pieces, a model that they can look at, I think can be incredibly helpful. And so I think that you would then have to, look at that individual experience, right? And sort of define whether or not they've been successful, whether or not it's good leadership from that perspective. If we're thinking about it from a higher level, the way I typically talk about leadership is from three pieces, and I mentioned a bit of them before. So I talk about leadership as a cycle, that there's always going to be these ups and downs.
Mm.
And so rather than sort of focusing on constantly acquiring these new skills, I think what's more important is for you to be able to gauge where you are within this leadership cycle. There's three pieces to it, super simple. Constantly cultivate your self-awareness. It can be as simple as, how am I feeling today? Do I need help? Do I not need help? That's like super simple, super basic. The second piece, how can I engage? And a lot of the leaders I work with are really busy. So typically it's around, how can I simplify engagement? So that's whether through processes, through systems. How can I engage with myself? How can I make the most of others? What do others need from me in order to be successful? Right? Some key questions. And because coaching is kind of my primary modality, you'll see that I do a lot of inquiry-based type work, because I think that's the best way for us to learn really as human beings. And then the last piece is really around what I call calibrating expectations. So I mentioned before that a lot of times we have a lot of implicit expectations, things that we're not actually sharing verbally, things that we're not writing down, things that two people aren't agreeing on. And I think that the best leaders are aware of the fact that we tell ourselves stories, that we make assumptions, that we are biased, that we jump to conclusions, and they try to eliminate that as much as possible. So they try to make the implicit explicit as much as possible. Other leaders might need to work on letting go and allowing other people to maybe own the process, right? So there's, every leader is a bit different. Other leaders are really good at detail-oriented work,
Mm.
execution-oriented, but they're not very visionary, which is something I know that was put in the chat. And
Yeah.
so each leader is going to have to work on different parts of the cycle in different ways, but that's kind of how I like to talk about it. And in terms of your final question around adaptive leadership, I will say that's not a word that I tend to use a lot.
Mm.
I do talk about leaders needing maybe to be flexible or adaptive, but adaptive
Mm.
leadership is sort of a specific framework or a specific way to look
Okay.
at leadership, and then look at how you bring people along. And adaptive leadership is really focused on, helping people, mobilizing people so they're able to handle tough challenges, right? So we live in a world that's, constantly changing. And so this is a particular framework that has sort of these principles and characteristics around supporting leaders with dealing with ambiguity in a specific way. So once again, it's not really a framework that I use. I think it
Okay.
can be very helpful, but I also think it can be incredibly confusing as well, because
Yeah.
there's so many moving parts. So I always like to
Sure.
talk about leadership from this perspective of, I support leaders with making leadership simple, in quotes. It's not
Okay.
easy, but I
Yeah.
always try and break it down into a little bit more what I consider essential components. And I find adaptive leadership, it can be very helpful once again, but I
Mm.
do think that it involves many moving parts. And so sometimes I think with people who have a lot of responsibility, when you provide them with a framework that involves many moving parts, that becomes more overwhelming, right? Because then they're just really focused on trying to do it right versus actually just trying to see how they can apply things in their context.
Mm. Yeah. Sure. And why would you consider adaptive leadership skills important to have? And as you mentioned, like, we're living in a constantly changing world. How can we hone these skills to help us lead better?
Yeah, I mean, just I think at it once again to make it simple, like the bare essence of it
Yeah.
is, for me, I think that leaders who are considering this adaptive leadership framework or adaptive leadership, however you want to define it, I think that they're able to lean into their curiosity, right? And I think, the key thing here to I guess take it down sort of one level, or maybe take it up one level, is this idea that, as human beings, as I mentioned earlier, we are meaning making machines, right? We're constantly telling ourselves stories, right? All of you on here, I'm sure, jumping on this call, even prior to getting on this call, seeing a picture of me, looking at my story, looking at my name, I'm sure you could jump to conclusions about where I grew up, who I am, maybe even the car I drive, how many children I might have, right? We have this ability as human beings that I think is super unique to be able to jump to these conclusions, make, make these stories, stereotype, right? So
Mhm.
based on my skin color, maybe there are some ideas on what you even thought my accent might be. And now that you've heard my accent, maybe there's some ideas on maybe where you think I grew up. And I think that that's really cool that we can do that as human beings.
Mm.
However, if you sometimes use those stories, assumptions, stereotypes, whatever you come up with,
Yeah.
I would say like 95% of the time, you will probably be wrong because we are a lot more nuanced as human beings. We can't fit into categories, even though we're constantly trying to fit ourselves and other people into
Mm.
categories, right? We're just a lot more complicated than that. And so I think that people who practice adaptive leadership, adopt adaptive leadership approaches, flexible leadership approaches, understand that. And they understand that though they jump to these conclusions, they might be wrong. And so they're open to learning, they experiment, they're curious. They
Mm.
don't think that their first thought is always the right thought. And they're
Yeah.
willing to challenge that and maybe challenge and create an environment where other people maybe feel comfortable as well doing that too. And so that's the way I would sort of think about adaptive leadership and why it's so very important.
Okay. So looking at what you've gone through as someone who has built teams before and you've coached a lot of people, you've led um yeah, diverse teams. What have been some of the challenges you've faced that required you to adapt or like change your leadership approaches or approach? And yeah, how did you address these challenges?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier on, I'm someone who I don't know why it's my parents' fault, I don't know, mom's fault, someone who's always like recorded things. I've always been somewhat goal oriented. Not goal oriented in a way where I'm like, I'm gonna beat myself about it, but I just have always liked tracking things to some extent. And I think that that
Yeah.
worked really well and has worked to my advantage as someone who's worked in leadership and now as someone who works for themselves. Like, so I use Notion now, and it's crazy the things I track. It's a little crazy. Like,
Oh, wow,
and
notion.
I always share with people because I'm just like, I'm a little crazy. Like, it's, I track all the things, personal things,
Yeah.
professional things.
Oh,
Like,
that's great.
this conversation's even in my tracker, and I track whether it was
Wow.
paid, unpaid, how many people showed up, the content I
Awesome.
shared, the link to, like, I track a lot of things. And so
Yeah.
that's worked to my advantage. And like I said, for some reason, this is just kind of how I've always been. And so that's worked to my advantage in that I can track things and I can see that if I've identified there's this thing I want to do and I'm not getting there. And to some extent, I've tracked sort of what I've been doing and the progress I'm making. I'm going to shift and do something different because this is not working for me. Okay. I'm not necessarily someone who's going to completely shift and like do things completely outside my comfort zone, but I've always been someone who's been willing to make incremental changes and to shift things because I know that there's something bigger or better out there for me. It's really weird. Like I can think back to different things in my childhood where that's what I've just always done. I don't understand it. I think that's just like sort of how I've naturally evolved. But I say that because when I had the opportunity to launch this business and build this team, I just realized the way I was showing up wasn't leading to the results that I wanted. I was just like, okay, this isn't working. Like I made this assumption, right? There was a story I told myself that obviously people should want to do things like X, Y, and Z because that's how
Mm.
I do them,
Mm.
right? Because I do
Mm.
it this way, therefore other people should want to do it this way. And I quickly realized, okay, that's not true, right? So once again, it was really around cultivating my awareness around this is my preference. However, this
Mm.
preference is not other people's preferences. How can I engage to learn, right? how they show up and how best to use them. And then last but not least, how can I how can I calibrate the expectations, shift the expectations, be more explicit with the expectations in order to allow that to move forward,
Mm.
right? So all of my work honestly comes from, or has started from, seeded from my own experience, recognizing that there were a lot of assumptions I was making, a lot of stories I was telling myself. I was biased in many ways, and it didn't lead to the results that I wanted. It
Mm.
wasn't getting me to where I wanted to be. I was overworking, right? I wasn't hitting the targets I was given. I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to have the personal life that I wanted. So something needed to shift.
Mm.
And the only way to do that was through recognizing, why, okay, I'm showing up this way, it's not working, and other people aren't showing up this way, so how can I make the most of them so that we can get towards this thing so I can pay them and pay myself? And so it's really through that, I think. And like I said, the way I do it, or the way I think about it, and talk about it, is sort of through this leadership cycle,
Mm.
cultivating my awareness. How do I want to show up? How can I, how can I set that expectation? And as we talk about expectations, a huge piece of expectation setting is actually reviewing that expectation and checking in, right? So
Yeah.
maybe, we have something that we've set for ourselves 1 year, like 1 year from now, can we check in every quarter to make sure that we're getting closer or further away, right? We're cultivating our awareness every quarter around that expectation that we've set. And then we're asking ourselves, do we need to engage differently? Do I need to show up differently? Or do I need to change the expectation
Mm.
so that we can move once again towards this bigger goal that we've set for ourselves? So that's kind of the way I do it. And then as it relates to this leadership cycle that I've mentioned multiple times, I actually started interviewing other leaders to sort of see how they do it when I started my coaching consulting practice, and I saw that they actually had a similar approach
Okay.
to doing things. They identified it, they decided they'd do something different, and they
Mm.
would sort of check in on that expectation that they set. And that's really where I would say that's the basis really of all my work, and all the things that I do currently. And I think that, you know, as I reflect on what I do now, it honestly, once again, also just comes from providing the support I wish I had, as a first time leader. If someone had told me that a lot of my initial thoughts were assumptions and they wouldn't be helpful, I think that would have been very helpful. And I think
Mm.
that a lot of times that lesson is something that leaders learn the hard way, unfortunately. They have to
Yeah.
go through something not great. They have to hit a wall. They maybe have to be sued. Someone has to leave the company.
Yeah.
They don't hit their targets and they waste all their funders' money before realizing that, oh, a lot of the times the things I'm telling myself aren't really helpful. And the things maybe I'm telling other people aren't helpful. And so how can I find that balance between, making sure that I'm showing up in a way that makes sense for me, but also recognizing that I don't work in a vacuum, right? And so this is also, I think, important as we think about adaptive leadership. I never recommend that people should do things that feel against their values or illegal, right? Like I'm not suggesting that you shift like that. What I'm suggesting is that you ask yourself whether or not the story you're telling yourself is leading you closer or further away from the goals that you've set, right? Because if you've set goals that are against your values, you're never going to get there because you're not going to like the process and what it takes to get there and what you have to give up to get there as well. And that's also around cultivating your awareness around some of those pieces too.
Great. Yeah. As you were talking, I realized that as monitoring, evaluation, and learning professionals, we do a lot of monitoring as our roles suggest, and like we always have these checklists or like things that aren't working well, especially when we are managing projects, and you're expecting the project life cycle to go a certain direction, and yeah, it hits like a hiatus and like things have to change, or like you're providing monitoring, evaluation, and learning support to teams on the ground, and maybe they end up feeding your data management system with the data you're looking for. So then like you have to find ways to change the way things are done, or like provide alternatives to the teams you're supporting on the ground on how they should send in that information. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from what you've just shared as as people even practicing monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And yeah, it cuts across,
I
irrespective
think
of where that's
everyone leads, right? You
yeah,
don't need to have a team member in order to lead, right? So in this
true.
case, I think your role is really unique in that, once again, you don't have like hiring and firing power, right? You're telling people what to do, but you can't
Exactly.
fire them, right? But they need you as well, right? So it's this really interesting relationship.
Mm,
And so a lot of times, right, it's around cultivating your awareness around, okay, I need this thing, maybe I typically ask for it in this way, but based on engaging with this person, this and this is
mm,
important to them. So how do I
yeah.
ask it in a way where like it's a win-win, right?
Mm,
I'm not like missing my milestones for what I need to produce,
true.
and I'm getting the information I need from them in order to do this as well, right? So I think it really, this idea of the cycle can be applied, I think, in so many different ways. But ultimately, it's about reminding ourselves that we don't work in vacuums. We need each other. Even I, as someone who works primarily for themselves, I need other people, right? I need partners. I need
Yeah.
people to support me in my business. I need people to support me finding opportunities, right? We're
Mm,
like, nobody, right, is on an island of their own. And I think
true.
that too is sometimes something that leaders have to learn too.
Mm,
And once again, whether you lead others or you're simply leading yourself, I think that's an important lesson.
yeah, it's true. Yeah, so I think related to the question I asked about your leadership ch or like challenges you've experienced, like how have they tested your ability to be flexible and adaptive? Like, can you say that like you've gained another like character trait, or maybe like um you've decided to include a particular character trait to like your, let's say, your list of, already existing character traits that probably you acquired because you went through a particular leadership challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really love what Christine actually put in the chat. She put here, leadership is learned the hard way
Yeah.
sometimes. And I think that we always should be learning from our experiences. What I have found with a lot of the leaders I work with is they tend to be incredibly busy, right? They tend to be in like this, I mean, imagine like a rat in like one of those cages and they're just like,
Yeah.
well, this, right? They're just so busy doing things that they don't have time to sit back and actually reflect on what's happening and the lessons learned and how they can do things differently. Um, and so, one of the things that really comes to mind for me is I've definitely evolved, right? And I think one of the things that I always share with people and they're always super surprised is like, I am actually not an extroverted person, even though I do work in a space where, people are somewhat extroverted in some ways. I am naturally not an extroverted person. I'm someone who went through a schooling system or a schooling approach that rewarded people who are able to verbally express themselves, right? So this is just a skill that I have learned, I have honed, I have practiced. I have thousands and thousands of hours. I have 100 podcasts alone. Each podcast is about 30 minutes, right? That already, right, tells you like the amount I just practiced within that. I've done thousands of workshops, thousands of facilitations. I've done over 500 hours of coaching. So it's just a lot of practice that I've had in order to hone this skill of being able to somewhat verbalize my thoughts. I still think I'm not that great at it. There's still lots of things I think I could do to improve, but this is something that I've been able to hone over time. I simply share that to say that it's not impossible to necessarily build these other skills if you've identified something as a goal, right? So I am motivated to do this because I really enjoy my work. I really love being able to provide the support I wish I had. And a way to do that is by being able to verbalize my perspective on frameworks, my experience that maybe other people can learn from, and creating these containers that at one point in time frightened me, right? But as I mentioned before, one of my values is a challenge. I love a challenge. And I think that, when I came across coaching, I sort of randomly was introduced to it by a colleague. I was like, this is really hard, but I want to figure it out because I love a challenge. Like I'm gonna figure this thing out.
Yeah.
And have I figured it out completely? No, but I do think it's something that I get better at because I'm willing to practice, I'm willing to try.
Mm,
And, yesterday I had a conversation with one of my one-on-one coaching clients, and she's like, yeah, I really want to build my confidence. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, but you have to try. Confidence doesn't
mm,
come from simply reading something or looking at something. It comes from trying something and, putting yourself out there and potentially failing. I have failed a lot. I still continue to fail, but it's an opportunity to learn from it. I think
mm,
that really sets in quotes, and once again, successful leaders apart, I think that, being willing to learn from my failures is something that has helped me get to where I am. If you had
Yeah.
told me, even when I was, working full time, that I'd be doing this, I would have laughed at you. Okay, because I don't remember what year this was, but maybe even at this point, could have been 10 years, 9, 10 years ago, I did this press conference with some of my colleagues. And I was so embarrassed because one of the reporters was like, I didn't understand anything you said. You spoke so quickly, and I do speak really quickly. It's not out of nervousness. I naturally have a very fast pace,
Hmm.
but he was like, in front of everybody, okay, talking 50 plus people. He was like, you have to repeat yourself because I didn't understand anything you said, and say everything you said again. And I was just so embarrassed, right? And now, I speak for a living. So like it is possible to evolve, it is
Mm.
possible to shift. But I
Yeah.
think it starts with, setting your goals, being really clear on, why it's important to you.
Yeah.
And then sort of setting, once again, those expectations for yourself. So if you're aware of, I don't like to use it as gap, but like if you're
Mm.
aware of this potential gap, how do you want to hone it? How can you build it? How can you set that expectation for yourself and then check in to sort of get better at it if that's something that you've identified for yourself? So I'm going to pause here. I don't know if I've answered your question
Oh, yeah.
directly. I feel like I've gone off on a tangent, but my hope was just to help illustrate how I've evolved. But I
Hmm.
think that it's the same values that have powered me from the beginning. I
True.
don't think that those core values have necessarily shifted.
Change. Yeah.
Maybe the way in which I've showed up, I've been willing to shift a bit. I've been willing to get outside my comfort zone a little
Mm.
bit. But you best believe I still spend a lot of time by myself where I don't
Mm.
speak. And when I don't have to speak, I don't. When I
Yeah.
go to events where I'm not speaking, like I'll talk to people one on one, but like no, like no, that's not what I'm here for, right?
True.
I'm not always in quotes on.
Mm.
But that's not to say that me showing up now in this way is inauthentic. This is still
Mm.
authentically me, but just
Yeah.
in a different context. And I'm okay showing up differently in different contexts,
True.
depending on what my intention is and why I'm there.
Mm. Yeah. I think you said something that really um struck a chord with me about like showing up and when not to show up. So like it's not every, let's say every appointment or like every maybe invitation that you honor. Like not that maybe you have any reservation towards the person who invited you or is trying to bring you on board to do something or for you to collaborate on. But yeah, I mean it's good to yeah, sometimes put some boundaries or barriers around like, the work you're doing. I mean, of course, you've set your goals, you know what you're in for. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes money can be like a motivational
Oh,
factor
oh, for
or
sure. And there's nothing
or
wrong with that.
people,
But
yeah.
you just have to understand what are the like, no, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You just have to
True.
understand the uh the impact of that, right?
Mm,
Is that sustainable? Probably
true.
not. If you're just
Yeah.
doing everything.
Yeah.
You're gonna give out at some point. So, what's the upside? What's the downside?
Yeah, that's true. And also looking at how it affects your well-being as a person. Because I mean, there's some people who can work hours and hours, and it's like if they don't, you know, put limits around what you're doing, they'll just yeah, burn out. And at the end of the day, like you can't really achieve much. Like you have your goals waiting, staring you in the face, and because you're not well, you can't do anything. So I think, yeah, it's also important that we know what we say yes to and what we decline politely. I mean, there will always be like another opportunity. And I've also come to realize that if there's something that is meant for you, it will always, no matter what, like it will always come back to you. Like, you always have that opportunity to, yeah, demonstrate who you are. And also people who are tied to your destiny will also benefit from what you're trying to do as well. So, yeah. I don't know if you have any comments on that, like how you're able to politely decline like, offers or like invitations that come your way and like what do you
Yeah,
use
I mean, I
as
would
your
say
guiding?
polite. That obviously is relative, right? Because there's some people who, yeah, it doesn't matter. I think I'm being polite, but to the other person, they think I'm being rude. So you can't, right? So I think a piece of it is just even maybe just reminding yourself that you can't control, right? So one of the things we talk a lot about in leadership is this idea of the, what do they call it? Is it circle of control, area of control? Like you just talk about like what you can control, what you can influence, and then things
Yeah.
outside of my control. I
Yeah.
can't control how other people perceive me. Of course, I can be intentional about how I show up and hope that I'm showing up in a way that is hopefully coming across to them in a particular way. But the reality is, and I mentioned this before, we all make assumptions. We all have these biases. And
True.
so because of the way I sound, my gender, where I choose to live, title I give myself, what people see when they go on my LinkedIn, right? They can come up with stories and I can't do anything about it. I can tell people I just don't have the capacity. And they could be like, well, she passed because of X, Y, and Z. And it's probably not true. And it's probably not useful for them to jump to those conclusions, but that's what we do as human beings. I
Yeah.
do it as well. We all do it.
We all do it. Yeah.
Um, and I think that, if we think about it from this perspective of setting ourselves up for success. So that's how I like to talk about it. Everyone, I think, maybe defines it a little bit differently, but that's what I like to think about it from the perspective of. I just know that I need a certain amount of sleep, I need to eat, and I need to move in order to be able to show up for my paying clients, right? So unfortunately, and sometimes I'll even put it this way, I was like, unfortunately, we live in a world where we do need access to financial resources. I did not create this world, okay? I want to be a farmer. I want to be a subsistence farmer. I want to have a garden and live in the middle of nowhere and not have to make any money.
Yeah.
However, we live in a world where there's just capitalism, and so we do need resources, right? And so I know in order to be able to generate resources for myself, or how I've identified how I want to generate resources for myself, I need to take care of myself in a particular way because I have to be able to show up and have conversations like this. In addition to that, I also know that it's really important to me to be able to provide the same level of service, the same type of content to people who maybe can't invest in me at
Yeah.
the level that I've identified I want an exchange for what I'm doing, right? And so as I've been building my business for the last 8 years, I've just been really intentional about these are my rates. You can't pay my rates. Maybe I'm willing to negotiate, but for the most part, peace out. Because I've set my rates at a particular place so that I can provide pretty much either pro bono, okay, or very low subsidized fees to other people. It
Yeah.
allows me to show up for things like this, right?
Yeah.
If I constantly was lowballing myself, I couldn't do things like this because I'd be constantly thinking to myself, I can't do free things. Even though I know to many people are like, oh, but it's just 1 hour of your time. It's not just 1 hour of your time, okay? When you do things like this, it's the time beforehand for prep and all the emails that have to be sent and making sure you have the timing right and making sure that you're taking care of yourself and seeing the questions in advance so that you can be prepared for the conversation.
Yeah.
It's the actual conversation. And then it's like afterwards, the time you need to decompress from doing things like this that involve a lot of time and energy as well, right? And people don't always see that, especially with the type of work that I do or I've decided to do, right? Because I think a key piece of this is also acknowledging that this is a choice.
True.
Not everyone necessarily has a choice in what they do. I think that's fair to say. But for a lot of people that tend to be in spaces with me, they do have a choice. They tell themselves a story that they don't have a choice, but the truth is they do. It's a hard thing to sometimes wrap our heads around, but we do have a choice, and I've chosen this. And so in addition to being very clear on what my rates are, being very clear on what I need in order to be successful, I also then try and create a space to be able to provide, have opportunities like this where I get to do things like this and provide people my thoughts, hopefully support them in some way. I'm not being paid for it, or I'm being paid very low, compared to my actual rate. And so I think knowing those things for yourself, especially when you're working for yourself, or it's even more important actually when you're working for yourself, because unlike people who maybe have a little bit more of a regular 9 to 5, and for everyone I know it's a bit different, but for people who have for the most part a regular 9 to 5, I don't get paid unless I show up, right? When you have a regular 9 to 5, even if you're working from an office, and if you're in the office physically from 9 to 5, you are not working every single hour you're there. That's just not how it works, right?
Yeah.
There's other things that are happening, but you still get paid. You maybe still have insurance. You have all these other things paid for you. For me, I don't have any of that. Those are things I have to provide for myself, right? And so I think a piece of it's also just knowing what I like to call your number. That can be kind of helpful. right? So I call it like knowing your survival number, so the minimum amount of money you need in order to just survive. And then like what I call sort of your ideal number or your lifestyle number, the number that you think you might want, right? Based on the lifestyle you want to co-create for yourself. And sort of based on that, that's where I've come up with my numbers for my rates. And then like the time I can also spend supporting other people. And so for me, it's really clear, right? So I'll know a piece of it. I know my capacity. I have a way of tracking that in Notion. And then I also, of course, have my time piece. So those are two different things though, because once again, as I've identified with something I actually show up for, there's a capacity piece where there's prep and then there's post. And that's not always something that you will see on a calendar, right? So someone can look at my calendar and be like, oh, but you have time in your calendar. What do you mean? And I'm like, I have to do all these other things. I have to send invoices. I have to follow up with clients. I have to create the content. I have to practice the content. I have to create the slides. And those are not things that we always keep track of. And so I have like a way in Notion to keep track of all these different projects I'm working on. So I understand my capacity and that helps me say yes and no to things. So that was a lot, but that all helps me feel really comfortable and confident to say no, right? So even as you reached out to me, I was like, look, unfortunately, don't have the capacity for that. I do not have the capacity to build a workshop. I don't. It's true, right? So can we have a Q&A? Right? So that also allows me to know, right? If you think about it from a negotiation perspective, they call it, what is it, your banta? Something like your best, like that you know your floor. I forget the real name for it when you're talking negotiation. So would love to do it, right? So there's a fit in terms of definitely like this is a group I would love to do something with. So it's a fit there. Timing wise, when you initially reached out, I was like, yeah, I don't have the time for this right now. I looked at my schedule. And then capacity wise, I don't have the time to create content for this. So can we do a Q&A, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. That was a really long response. I'm sorry.
That was really helpful. Thank you so much. So, yeah, I think we're gradually coming to an end, but I also want participants to have the opportunity to ask. So maybe I can just maybe stop asking and then give our participants the opportunity to come in, and then I will come in with my final questions, and then we can end the session. So, are there any questions from participants here with us? Christine, Evelyn, Lauren, any questions or comments? If you're not able to speak, you can also type them in the chat. Okay, I guess people are thinking about their questions or their comments. Okay, I'll just continue with what I have then. So what advice do you have for people in leadership or those aiming to develop adaptive leadership skills? And also if there are any resources you can recommend, yeah, for people who are aspiring to be leaders or like people leading teams. Yeah, any thoughts, anything to share on those?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that really comes to mind, and I think once again, just because of how I think in threes, I think in fives, that's also sort of best practices as it relates to like adult learning and learning in general.
Okay.
You know, three things. I think that when you're a leader, you need to remind yourself that your team members are not you, right? And that's why it's so important to constantly cultivate your awareness. And I think that if you remind yourself of that, you're going to approach things, I think, from a lot more of an effective point of view. The second thing I think you need to remind yourself as a leader is that you don't know your team members. And so that's why you actually have to take the time to engage, get to know their strengths and weaknesses, get to know why they're here, get to understand what they want in exchange for their work. Because money is not everything. And there definitely, you know, there's research that shows this. There comes a time where giving people more money is not going to lead to better results or higher performance. And so you really need to engage to get to know your team members better. And that's actually your role as a leader. Your role as a leader is to actually create an environment where you're leveraging your strengths and you're giving your team members an opportunity to leverage their strengths and the value, you know, the value that they can add and contribute. That's what I think the role really of a leader is. And then I think the last piece is really around reminding yourself that your team members are not mind readers. They don't know what you want, you know? Even sometimes, you know, especially, you know, if you're working within a, you know, a startup, and I tend or initially worked with a lot of leaders within startups, and yesterday did this workshop with leaders at startups. And so maybe this is why it's fresh in my mind. It's just this idea that a lot of times we think we're being clear about our expectations, but we're not, right? And that's the reason why you have to engage to sort of understand like what's going to motivate this person. You know, even to your point about the work you do, and how you're sort of working beside people who you can't like, what are you gonna do? You can't really threaten them with their job, you know, but you need this information from them. And that's why it's so very important for you to get really curious about, okay, what's important to them? How can I set expectations with them where it's aligned? You know, sometimes that might mean initially a little bit of hand holding and maybe a little bit of micromanagement. But you know, ultimately it's going to get you to the end goal, and they're going to hopefully build this skill where they can also do it. And if they can't build the skill, right, then the other piece of advice is, you know, where do you maybe need to let go of people, and it being okay with potentially letting people go because they're maybe not going to be able to contribute wherever your, you know, where your company currently is, or where your department or your team currently is, and that's okay too. It was a hard lesson for me to learn, but I think that sometimes people are better off in other places, and I think that's okay, right? We don't have to just keep people for the sake of keeping them, and so I think that's another sort of leadership thing to have to wrap your head around. In terms of resources, I think that there are a ton of resources out there. I'm happy to share my podcast link. So I could put that in the
Yeah,
chat if that's okay, if people
certainly.
want to see that.
Yes.
So this is sort of my podcast link, and let's see, I don't know if I can copy. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to copy this. I was gonna see if I can put a QR code to see if that would be easy to copy in the chat as well.
Okay.
But you know, if you want to hear some of my thoughts, and I've actually interviewed quite a few leaders as well on their perspective, you know, recommend you take a listen to my podcast. It's currently on hiatus. I might bring it back, but I have over 100 episodes, and lots of interviews, called Open Door Conversations podcast. So that's one way. So those are free. And so what I've done here is I put them into playlists in specific areas that a lot of leaders tend to just, what I would say, like, are part of that leadership cycle. So if there's a
Yeah.
particular part of the cycle you're interested in, you can sort of look at it from that perspective. So there's that. Beyond that, there's a ton of free resources online as well. I think there's always things to read,
Hmm.
but rather than reading and maybe even thinking about trying to get things externally of you, I'd recommend that the first thing that all leaders should do is create some sort of reflection ritual, some sort of habit and routine around creating space, but more importantly, not just creating. Because I would say that, especially when I'm working one-on-one, a lot of times I'm being paid simply to help leaders reflect, which sounds super silly
Mm.
to a lot of people. But the thing is, once again, I mentioned this idea of the rat race, of being in that wheel. A
Yeah.
lot of leaders don't create time for that. And so I
Mm.
think that you can become even more successful, however you define success, simply by having a ritual, a habit, a routine of simply reflecting on how you define success and the things you want to keep track of. That, just doing that, will allow you to cultivate your awareness, will allow you to think about how you might want to shift, re-engage in a different way, and will allow you to really calibrate your expectations so you can get further, or sorry, get closer to the things that you've identified as goals, or the things that you've identified as success, or the things that you've identified as targets.
Yeah.
And I think this type of habit is helpful both in your personal and your professional life.
Mm.
And so I think that's where most leaders should start. Setting time aside, but more importantly, honoring it. Because I
Mm.
work with so many leaders that say, yeah, I put it in my calendar, but this came up and I had to do this. And this was more important. Honestly, there's nothing more important than you, right?
Yeah.
We're all replaceable, right? To be honest. So,
True.
you know, especially in the workplace perspective. And so cultivating a habit like that,
Yeah.
I think that's tremendous. That to me is true wealth. Having space to reflect on that.
Mm.
That's really what's going to drive growth. That's what's going to drive curiosity. That's going to drive however you
Mm.
define success.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. Coming back to our participants, do you have any questions, any comments, or would you like to share any takeaways from our session today? Okay, I will start with my takeaways. So yeah, it's been a very lovely discussion, very, you know, reflective, thinking through what you've gone through as a leader and some of the things that you've shared with us today. I'm also thinking through like I can change as a leader in my own right. So I have some takeaways I'd like to share. So first thing is to lead yourself and then cultivate self-awareness, identify ways of overcoming your weaknesses, and then calibrate your expectations. Those are the things I'm taking away from our conversation. All right. Any final thoughts from you, Akia, as we end the session? Okay, wait,
I mean,
before you
my
come
only
in,
thought is, oh yeah, there's
I
somebody
think
in the
Christine
chat.
has,
Reflection.
yeah, reflection is key. Yeah.
I think it's the starting point of everything. I think the only thing I would say is I've never been the biggest fan of using the word weakness. I think that
Okay.
far too often we actually sort of spend time on like this idea that like there's a weakness
Hmm.
or a gap, right? I
Hmm.
mean, I prefer the word gap over weakness, right? I
Okay.
think it's really about sort of asking ourselves like if there's something I want to strengthen, an area I see where there might be a gap, right?
Yeah.
How do I want to go about it? And sometimes we're not the solution, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes it's about finding someone else who's good at that thing. And that's the reason why I don't always like the word weakness, because it sometimes makes us feel like we have to be the ones to strengthen it. Where a lot of times it's better to get somebody else who has that competitive advantage in that thing. Does that make sense? I think that's a really important lesson for a leader to learn as well. You don't have to do it all. You don't have to be good at it all. And that's why I like to sort of define leadership from this perspective of leadership when you're talking about it in reference to other people. It's about creating that environment for people, for you, first and foremost, as a leader, to leverage your strengths, and then allowing whoever's following you or whoever's within your team or department or company to use their strengths as well. Versus like, oh, it's a space for them to like strengthen their weaknesses. Yeah, obviously, like there's some of that too, but it's focused more on you being able to do what you have a competitive advantage in, and then the people that you have on your team, what they have a competitive advantage in as well, for at least the majority of their time. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those final thoughts with us, Akia. All right, so we'll be ending our session soon. Okay, there's more reflections coming in from Christine. So she's saying a good leader is a good collaborator with the team, servants leadership. Okay. Any
I will
comments
say
on
I
that?
do. I have thoughts on servant leadership. I'm not the biggest fan,
Fan of
but
that.
I think
Okay.
it's helpful because once again, I don't think we need to be defining leadership as a thing, right? As servant leadership or this type of leadership. I think what's more important is we recognize there's going to be ups and downs. So there are times where I think leveraging servant leadership would be really helpful. But if you're looking at, an entire year, you can't always be a servant leader. And I think that's okay. Right. So it's more about knowing, once again, adapting, being flexible. When is being a servant leader helpful? When is it actually a detriment to me as a leader? Because I've seen people who talk about themselves having servant leaders burning out. I've seen it a lot also in nonprofits. And I find sometimes that nonprofits can be yeah, I mean, like any organization, but I find overwhelmingly they can be quite manipulative workplaces because it comes from this perspective of we're doing these things for good, right? We're having this positive impact, so you should work for nothing. And it's like, no, that's not the way it works. We live in
Hmm.
a capitalist world. If the world was different, sure, I'd work for rainbows and butterflies and thank yous, but we need something in exchange for what we're doing. So
True.
yeah, I think servant leadership, once again, a very powerful approach,
Hmm.
but I don't think, with any type of leadership, it's not something that you can always practice
Always
because there
practice.
are external factors and then sometimes internal factors that we
Hmm.
should adapt to, be flexible for,
Hmm.
and leverage different things.
True. Awesome. Thank you so much for your response there. I hope, Christine, you're
I
satisfied.
think
Okay,
she
I
dropped
see.
off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think she
she's
dropped
dropped
off.
off.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so please do well to provide us with feedback before you hop off. So I've dropped a form there. So I hope you're able to access the link. And then you can follow Women in RML on X. I've dropped the link as well. And then also our LinkedIn page as well. So please do well to follow us. Okay, wait, let me see. I think. what I shared earlier was the link to our YouTube channel. So this is rather our X page. So what I've shared now is the X page. So you can access content on our YouTube channel, which I've shared as well, and the recording from our discussion today will be uploaded there as well. So you can go back and soak in everything that Ikea has shared with us today. And hopefully, yeah, you can always go back and also share with others as well. So, Ikea, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing so much from your life on your leadership journey. And yeah, we're wishing you the best in everything that you seek to do in all your endeavors. And yeah, hopefully would invite you again because at least once a year we try to have like a session on something that is more leadership focused instead of like the technical monitoring, evaluation, and learning topics. I think it's also important that we build our soft skills as professionals because yeah, I mean even within our space, like the opportunities to lead teams. And I also shared during the session while you were contributing about how sometimes it can be a bit, yeah, some of the challenges that we experience as monitoring, evaluation, and learning professionals trying to manage teams in the field as they report back to us on activities and also hope to report on impacts as well of things that are happening on the ground. Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah, we hope we'll get you back here again with us to share more about leadership. And hopefully, those who participated, you can access all the resources that IKEA talked about. And you can also reach out to her if you feel like you would want a coach, a leadership coach, to help you on your journey as a leader or just to help you to, come out of your shell or come out of your comfort zone. So thank you so much, IKEA, and everyone who joined us today. Right. Take care. Bye.